Hutchinson of JVP Group, and I'm joined today by Alyssa Thursfield of HR Anchor and Gamlin's Law. Thank you for joining us.
Thanks, Kath. Great, so thanks for that introduction, Kath. For those of you who haven't heard me speak before, my name's Alyssa. I'm Head of Employment at Gamlin's Law, and I'm also the Managing Director of HR Anchor. So we're here to talk about insights for your workforce and some legal updates. We're going to touch on COVID because, you know, I think I've got the figure here. We're 22 months, 3 weeks and 5 days since the first rules came into force in 2020. I think for some of us it feels significantly longer. So we are going to touch on where we're at with COVID. I did have to update the slides yesterday. Thanks, Boris, again. We've sort of got used to these 11th hour changes over the last 22 months. First of all, if you're in England, if you develop symptoms or test positive, isolation is 10 days or 5. Venues at the moment can ask for COVID passes. Face coverings are still required in healthcare settings and on London public transport. Shops can request that people wear face coverings, and the guidance to work from home has ended, so we're back in the office. Care homes, there's no limit on visitors anymore. And then we got the announcement yesterday, breaking news, that all isolation rules are potentially going to be scrapped at the end of February in England. So, all the checking up that we did yesterday, potentially a waste of time to give you that list of rules if at the end of the month all of that is going to lift. And that does include, for people who test positive, they will no longer need to isolate if the restrictions lift. People will be allowed to move around communities and in public buildings, even if they're testing positive. If you're in Wales, however, we haven't had any updates as yet to say what's going to be lifting. I've had a notification, because I work with the emergency services, to say that they have actually reduced their incident level. So we are expecting some sort of update from the Welsh Government. Whether they'll go as far as England, we're not sure. Typically, when we look at how things have panned out over the last 22 months, Mark Drakeford does tend to just hold a little bit shy of what's going on in England. So we're not expecting a total lifting of restrictions. So in Wales, if you develop symptoms or test positive, then it's isolation for 10 days or 5. COVID passes for cinemas, theatres, concerts and events. Face coverings are compulsory in schools, on public transport, shops and hospitals. There's testing in secondary schools, and there is guidance to work from home, but it's not mandated. So, Gary, on the Scottish rules, the reason why we don't tend to cover Scotland is because their employment law is much more of a devolved issue. They've got their own tribunals, but generally it mirrors what's going on in Wales as well. So Drakeford and Sturgeon tend to be sort of on a par with what their rules are. If you do want further clarity on the Scottish rules, I can confirm those to you afterwards as well. So remote working, it's still a huge topic. There's a move back to the office that we're seeing in some of the larger cities. We're seeing a flurry of flexible working requests. And then we've also seen a lot in the press around the great resignation. So people going, right, I've had enough of this. I want to change my life. I want to work in a different way. And, are resigning in droves. Now, I can't say that many of my clients have experienced this great resignation. I would say the experience that we've had is there's a lot more engagement between employers and employees about what they want their workplace to be like. We've seen lots moving over to hybrid working arrangements. And certainly we're seeing it in recruitment as well. It's a very key and important topic for candidates. It's often the first question that gets asked. I was talking to Kath about this at the start of the session, that immediately upon accepting an offer, we're often seeing now, can I work from home? So I think we are seeing a shift in the way that people are working. I'd be interested to know if any of you have experienced the great resignation, either yourselves, whether you've decided to up and go and change the way that you're working and living, or whether you work in a company that has seen a shift in that workforce. So whilst we're at this point, it is worth mentioning on a flexible working aspect, a bit of a reminder on the law here, that people do have the right to request flexible working, but it's not an absolute right for it to be granted. Now, we are going to come on to flexible working when I talk about the 2022 changes in terms of what we're anticipating. But at the moment, it's not a day one right. You have to work for your employer for 26 weeks before you can put the request in, and there's no absolute right for that to be granted. what I would say is, for people who have been working for you through the pandemic and have either been working remotely or flexibly or changed the way that they're working, if this request comes in, you need to consider what is reasonable in the light of how they have been working. Now, just because someone has been working from home for the last 22 months does not mean that they automatically are going to have to be granted a request that they make. But what you need to make sure of is, if you're going to be refusing that request or altering that request, that it is reasonable. And there are limited reasons that you can refuse a flexible request. They're listed on the screen there. So burden of additional cost, inability to reorganise work amongst staff, inability to recruit, where there'll be a detrimental impact on the quality of work or performance, a detrimental impact on ability to meet customer demands, insufficient work for period requested. Now, this is one that does crop up quite a lot. So where you've got someone who might say, look, 9 to 5 is not working for me anymore. I want to be able to do the school run. I want to be able to get the kids from, pick the kids up from school. Can I start working at 6, finish at 8, have a couple of hours off, do a bit in the lunch hour, and then work later at night? Ultimately, if so you're customer facing and your customers aren't going to be awake at 6 o'clock in the morning or working at 9 o'clock at night, that might be where you can reject a request to say that there's insufficient work at those times. And also, if you've got planned structural changes to your business, which we're seeing a lot of now as people are, coming into this new world. Perhaps, they're looking at downsizing offices if they have got people who are working in a hybrid way, or looking at being more efficient so that they can shore up against potential future changes. So don't forget that you've got those limited reasons to refuse. Make sure you're reasonable in the way that you are communicating and deciding things, and don't forget to follow a process. If you don't have a process already in-house or in your handbooks or anything like that, make sure you check out ACAS, because there is a good one on there that you can follow. So, sick pay updates. So we did have a bit of a change in December. It sort of was like no news, and then on the 10th of December it was everywhere saying, oh, sick notes are changing. It was only for a set period. So between the 10th of December 21 and the 26th of January 22, the requirement to go and get a fit note or a sick note after 7 days disappeared. It became 28 days, apparently to alleviate the pressure on GPs during what would typically be quite a busy period anyway. Why am I mentioning that when the 26th of January has passed? Because anyone whose sick leave started in that period, so if someone went off sick on the 26th of January, it's going to apply to them. However, for anyone who's gone off sick after the 26th of January, we're back to normal. We're back to the 7 days and self-certification before that date. So the great sick pay debate. We're going to come on to now talking about companies not paying sick pay and the unvaccinated. We've seen loads of debates about this. I've been talking to the BBC 2 or 3 times about this over the last few weeks. And I'm going to do the first poll here. So I think that should come up for you now. The results are anonymous, but at this point, I'd like to ask you to answer the poll, yes or no. Do you believe it is reasonable for an employer to reduce company sick pay for the non-vaccinated? So if you click on the poll on the taskbar, I think that should have come up.
You should be able to see that in the chat.
Yeah. Okay, so we're 50-50, 50-40, 50-50 again. Okay, so we're quite split. So we've got, oh no, we're still going. Okay. Kath, can everybody see the results on that, or is it just me? Just because I'll give what the final result is.
I'll vote. I'll then end the poll so you can see.
Okay.
So if you want the poll,
right. Okay, so I'll end it there. So I'll do. Yeah. So it sort of hovered around 50-40, and then it settled at, so people, 61% of you think that's not reasonable, and 38% think that it is reasonable. Now, I'm going to ask you the question again in a few moments when I've been through this next section, but we are going to reword it slightly. So let me just make a note of those figures, and let's see if we get a change. Not that I'm advocating either way, it's an interesting debate. So there's much in the press about companies not paying sick pay for people who are unvaccinated. Now, my advice with this is look beyond the headlines. What we're not seeing is companies that are refusing to pay company sick pay for people who are testing positive. If someone is unvaccinated and testing positive for COVID, so they've got COVID, the general consensus seems to be those people are still receiving company sick pay. Now, I'm talking about very specifically here company sick pay, because obviously employers generally, as long as it's in the contract, have got a discretion to apply company sick pay or not. SSP would still be paid. So the companies that have been in the headlines for applying this, we've got Next, IKEA, Morrison's and Wessex Water. Coming out on the other side of it, we've got John Lewis, who are saying absolutely no way we're going to give full sick pay to everybody, whether they're vaccinated or unvaccinated. Now, as I've said, what this relates to isn't people not paying who've tested positive. It relates to staff who are not ill but have been pinged. So they're a close contact, they've been pinged and they've got to isolate because they're a close contact and they're not vaccinated. So the current rules, until the end of February in England anyway, are if you've been vaccinated and you're pinged as a close contact, you can carry on life as normal. However, if you're unvaccinated and you get pinged, then you have to isolate. So you're at home, you can't go to work, you're not ill, so should those people still get sick pay? So I'm now going to ask the question again with another poll, which is, so do you believe it's reasonable for an employer to reduce sick pay for those who are pinged and who are not vaccinated? So they're not ill, they're at home because I'm going to clarify it slightly. We're taking out people who are pregnant, disabled, or medically cannot have the vaccine. These are people who have chosen not to be vaccinated, either because they don't agree with it or they don't want it. So is it reasonable for those people not to get company sick pay because they're at home because they've been pinged and they're not sick? Okay, so this doesn't look quite as balanced. So I'm going to give you, I quite like a gut decision. So I'll count down from 5 and then we'll end the poll. So 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Great. So this is much more the other way. So we've got 76% of you who are saying that it is, it's reasonable to reduce it, and 23% of you are saying no, it's not. So we have seen a shift there with more people saying that actually that is more reasonable. I'm not agreeing either way. It's a debate that we're having with lots of employers. There's lots of companies sort of ringing saying, what do I do about this? Money's a bit tight, furloughs ended. Do we really have to pay company sick pay to people who are not in because of something that's their choice? We then get into the realms of, well, if people are smoking and they have COPD, or people who go mountain biking and fall off and break their legs, are they responsible for their own absences as well? However, I do point out again in those circumstances that generally those people are off sick actually with an illness or an injury. It's not that they're sat at home perfectly well and unable to attend work. So there's a lot of assets to this. There's some really interesting legal and moral debate about it. And there's been some great stuff on LinkedIn. So I know a lot of you who are on also know Claire Davis at 1850, which is a great HR company and someone that I work with, and she put a debate on LinkedIn this week, and that was, it was really interesting to see people's comments about it. There's lots of people who are very passionate about the subject, so thanks for that, and thanks for the engagement on that. It's been interesting to see how the opinion has shifted. So in terms of then the legalities of it, if you've got company sick pay, if it's in the contracts that it's applied with discretion, you can apply that discretion to decide whether or not you are going to pay it. However, you need to ensure that when applying that discretion that you're not discriminatory in how you're doing it, which is why we've got that carve out around if someone's got a disability and they can't have the vaccine because of that disability, then that's obviously different. So just be mindful that it should never be a blanket policy with anything like this. It should still be taken on a case-by-case basis. So moving on to some slightly less contentious subjects, employment law changes in 2022. So this is a list of, there's a lot that's going to be coming out in 2022. And, I might have a chat with Cass about maybe if we do some follow-up sessions as we go on through the year. And if we once we get to April, which is again when we tend to see quite a lot more coming out of government, if we perhaps do a follow-up session just on what the changes are, because this year does look like it's going to be a busy year. The government did very little with employment in the last 22 months because of COVID, so I think we're going to see quite a lot crammed into this year. I think we're going to see the COVID fallouts in tribunal, the usual rate changes in April, potentially some movement on the employment bill, which has been kicked around for a few years now, potentially some updates to whistleblowing. We're going to have a chat quickly about the extra bank holiday and also gender identity, which is, again, a really big subject for this year. So COVID fallout, as we always see with the tribunal, we're seeing loads of conflicting decisions coming out of some of the employment decisions that have been made by companies over the last 2 years around refusing furlough, dismissals for people refusing to return to the office. So we had a dismissal due to refusal to attend work because of a fear of COVID was found to be fair. And then there was another case that found it to be unfair. We had a case where someone who was dismissed for refusing to wear a mask, that was a fair dismissal. And then within a couple of months, there was another one that found it in a different set of circumstances, it was unfair. Now, what we're seeing here is that the cases are very fact sensitive. And most of those decisions where they're conflicting, and we've got one saying it's fair, one saying something's unfair, comes down to the process and the reasonableness of the decisions that are being scrutinised. So we're back to basics. Those employers that followed a process and they were reasonable in their decision making, and they had, it was well backed up with the reasons why they've made those decisions, they are more likely to fall on the side of having been fair. However, the employers that have gone with knee-jerk reactions or strictly enforcing a policy without really applying much in terms of, well, this is why we're doing it and this is why we're not making an exception, they fall and foul of it a bit more often. So I think we're sort of seeing the final flush out of those cases now. What we're likely to see over the next few months and the remainder of this year is contested decisions on flexible working. So where people have either been refused flexible working and have resigned and claimed constructive dismissal, and then bring employment tribunal proceedings to say that the decision to not allow flexible working was totally unreasonable and therefore a breach of contract, or potentially disability discrimination claims where someone perhaps has either been badly affected by COVID or has had a disability that means that they're working more effectively from home. We'll probably see disability discrimination brought into that. So I'm just going to touch on one of the questions that was sent in advance, which is long COVID likely to be classed as a disability? Again, it's going to come down to the individual facts of each case, which I know is the most unhelpful answer in the world. Sorry about that. However, where you've got someone who has got a long-term condition, so likely to last more than 12 months, and has a detrimental impact on their day-to-day life, the chances are, yes, in some instances, we are likely to see long COVID being caught under the Equality Act. Now, it might be, as we've got, say, with obesity at the moment, so obesity is not classed as a protected characteristic. It's not classed as a disability under the Equality Act. However, if someone who is obese has breathing difficulties or diabetes, those individual conditions will get them over the line in terms of having that protection. So it may well be that long COVID itself isn't recognised as a disability, but in terms of those individual symptoms, so for example, someone with COPD that's made significantly worse by long COVID, or other conditions that are sort of coming out of it, then they may well be caught by those in any event. So if you do see any headlines that say long COVID in itself is not a disability, make sure that you're reading up on that properly, just to make sure that, again, it's not like that obesity decision, and that if there are any conditions that are caught by it as a result, that someone might still have that protection. Rate changes. So national minimum wage and living wage are going up, SSPs going up, maternity pay and parental payments, lower earnings limits, so for things like your pension and all that stuff, all of that's going up. It's all in line to change from April. We do have a detailed table, so when this is all finished, that's going to be a handout that's going to come round to you all, rather than just put a load of numbers on the page and everyone try and screenshot it. We'll hand that out. Now, what hasn't been announced yet is any changes to the basic award and the compensatory award limits for unfair dismissal, and the vento bans for injury to feelings and discrimination awards. They go up every year, so we are expecting the changes within this month, but they've not been announced yet. So when those do come out, we will update that handout and we can recirculate it again if anybody wants to receive that. And it's on one page, so it's really easy to print it off, stick it by your desk, or keep it as a screensaver if you're as much of an employment geek as me. So what do we need to do prior to April? So review your wages, review your wage bill to account for national living wage and national minimum wage. It is a bit of a jump this year, so we're going up to £9.50. So in terms of what the impact on your staff could be, if you've got a lot of staff on national minimum wage, you could be looking at quite a significant wage bill jump. I've got a client who's got, I think, 10 staff out of 100 who are on national minimum wage, and their wage bill's going up by about £8,000 when you account for national insurance, pension, and the holiday increases. So do make sure that you've had a look at that you know who's going up. Make sure you don't miss it, because you don't want the national minimum wage claim because you get named and shamed. And just make sure that you know what that financial impact is going to be as well. So the employment bill. What's the employment bill? Government has recognised that our employment law needs updating. We've got tests that have been around for 40 years, so the virtual test, and we've had a pre-question actually about that, so I'll come on to that in a moment. We've got the Employment Rights Act, which is now decades old. Even the Equality Act now is over 10 years old. And then we've got things like the Uber decision and Pimlico, and so things around worker status. It's all kind of getting all mushed up, and it's all relying on tribunal decisions to show us, sort of where we're going with everything. So the idea was that the employment bill was going to tidy everything up. The Good Work Plan was put together before COVID. There was a review. There was lots of feedback from industries about how they think the employment law in the UK should be transformed. And it was basically kicked into the long grass with COVID, and there wasn't any progress with it. Now, what we are expecting this year is not that all the changes will come in. We think it's going to be staged. What we're expecting is that flexible working, that the right to request flexible working will become a day one right. Now, it's not guaranteed that's going to happen. That's just sort of what we're picking up from sort of the rumour mill, and sort of having a chat with people who are, not influencing policy, but who are consulting on it, should we say. So that is what we're expecting, that this having to wait for 6 months before you can request flexible working is becoming very out of date. So in terms of how you might want to address that, it's something that, as I stated earlier on in the presentation, that more and more candidates are raising this at the time of recruitment, at the time offers are made, and that actually it's a good one to get ahead of the curve with, so that it's not such a big change if this does come in. What we're also expecting, because it's well overdue, is clarification on worker status. So what I mean by this is the test for who is employed, who is a worker, and who is self-employed. So for those of you perhaps at the start of your HR or employment law journey, employees, they have the gold standard in terms of employment rights. They basically, if you're working for somebody and you want security and you want entitlement to payments, your rental payments, and your holidays and everything else that goes with it, you want to be an employee. Workers kind of sit in the middle between employees and the self-employed. So you get people on 0 hours contracts. They're not quite entitled to as much. They don't get as much protection. But equally, they get loads of flexibility. They can take shifts. They can refuse shifts. They can work for other people. Students often like this, or people who don't quite want the insecurity of being self-employed, but are quite happy sort of gigging around and picking up work here and there. And then you've got the self-employed, where they're in business for their own aim. They're not answering to anybody, and rather than having an employer, they've got clients. Now, where we're seeing the waters getting muddied is between worker status and self-employed. So for those of you who've been doing your IR35 checks or IR35 contracts, who've been trying to keep up with Uber and Pimlico and, sort of where it all falls, there isn't a very, very clear test, because you've got HMRC tests, which will say for tax purposes whether someone is employed or a worker or self-employed, and then you could have a tribunal that makes a totally different decision. What we're expecting is that the two tests are going to be aligned, and there's going to be a lot more clarity around who's employed, who's a worker and self-employed, and we're also expecting that the worker status is going to get a little bit more protection and a bit more security. So what we're expecting with that is that they're given notice of shifts. So rather than just ringing up on the day saying, here's a shift, that actually they get a bit more notice about it, and that they get more protection around cancellation of shifts and that sort of thing. And also potentially once someone, for example, has been on a 0 hours contract for over a year, that we are going to expect that they'll have to be offered a more secure arrangement. They won't just be able to sit on a 0 hours contract for years and years. So again, there's been no clear announcements about any of this. This is just what we think is going to be coming. So just touching on one of the questions that we had in advance about whether the Birchill test or the Daubney test have changed. So for those of you, again, who are at the start of your journey, the Birchill test is all around, well, it's one of the most well-known employment cases. It sets out the test about how an employment tribunal decides whether an employer has acted reasonably. So if we're talking about misconduct, the questions that are asked are, did the employer reasonably believe that an employee was guilty of alleged misconduct? Did the employer have genuine grounds to suspect that an employee was guilty, and was a reasonable investigation carried out before making a decision on guilt? That's still around. It's a 40-year-old test. There was in 2018 a bit of a challenge to that, but as far as we're aware, no, that hasn't changed. In terms of the Daubney test, that's where if you've got someone off on long-term sick, employers have got to take sensible steps to consult with an employee and do a medical investigation and look at the medical position before dismissing on the grounds of ill health. Again, we're not aware of any changes with that at the moment, and we are expecting that is going to remain. Happy to be corrected on that if there is anything that we've missed, but as far as we're aware, that's still the up-to-date position. The other change we're expecting this year is relating to whistleblowing. So even though we're not in the EU anymore, there is an EU whistleblowing directive that hardly any states have complied with on time. However, putting that to the side, it doesn't actually apply to the UK, but experts do think that we're likely to come into alignment with it. Now, the key around that is it will be around providing feedback to whistleblowers within certain timescales. So if someone blows the whistle, we're expecting it to become a statutory requirement that they are given feedback on the issues that they have raised and within a reasonable timescale. We've seen nothing in draft in the UK about that. Again, we'll probably be sending around updates if there is any indication of anything clearer on that. So in terms of preparation for something like this, what we would be saying at the moment as a minimum is make sure that you have a look at your whistleblowing policies, make sure that your line managers and your senior management team are actually familiar with the whistleblowing policy and how it works and the timescales that are in there, so that if it does become more stringent and we're going to see more requirements on companies, that you're not starting from day one and having to learn all about your whistleblowing again, so that you're a bit more sort of briefed and up to date on it. The extra bank holiday. So I should have put another poll in here, actually. So who's giving it to staff or who's having it? So we're getting asked this a lot. Do we have to give the extra bank holiday, and do we have to pay for it? Now, it comes down to what your contract states. So if the contract states that an employee gets 20 days plus bank holidays, they're automatically entitled to the extra day. So they're going to get 29 because of the extra one this year. If the contract states that they get 20 days plus the usual 8 bank holidays, then that additional day, it gets lumped up into there. So they're going to lose one of the 20. It's going to become 19 days plus the usual. It'll be 19 days that they can take when they want, and then 9 bank holiday days. It's discretionary, essentially. Now, there is no legal entitlement to bank holidays unless you've got it in the contract that they get bank holidays off. So if you're a company that is working, on, say, your peak time is through the summer, you need staff in on a bank holiday, then you don't have to have staff off on that day. It can be given as a day in lieu. Kath, you've appeared. Has my sound gone off or something?
The poll is there for you, Melissa. So
oh, right. Okay.
There's the poll section there, just below chat.
Oh, great. Oh, yes, 100% giving it. That's good. I mean, it's, particularly after what everybody's been through, the general consensus is give everybody the extra day this year. But look, if you are a seasonal business, or if you rely heavily on people being in on bank holiday days, you can give that day in lieu at another time. You don't have to have people off on that day. Gender identity. So as COVID hopefully starts to become a distant memory, we think this is going to be the subject of 2022. It is protected as a legitimate belief under the Equality Act. So if someone has a very real and very strong belief either in their identity, whether it's gender or not, that is, as we've had that confirmed, that is a legitimate belief and it is protected. There is rafts of litigation on the way about this. There's some really high-profile cases that are being brought. There's a really interesting Bristol University case at the moment where there is a female student, I think she's a PhD student in Bristol, who has essentially been trolled for making a comment about gender and people giving birth. I have to be very careful about what I say as well, because you should be respecting other people's beliefs, and we should be respectful of the way people want to live their lives. Unfortunately, what we're seeing is this spilling over into a culture of trolling and hate speech and litigation. So we will be doing updates on the key cases as they progress. The reason why I'm raising it here is just to say this issue should be treated very, very carefully if it becomes an issue with one of your staff or for your company. There can be huge PR consequences if it's handled badly. We're seeing very militant movements on both sides about this issue. And like I say, it brings the risk of trolling and harassment as well. So if you've got a staff member who says something unfortunate or says something that's been taken the wrong way, there's potentially welfare issues with them if they are going to be at risk of trolling and harassment. And it's very important that the welfare of your staff and also the way people are treating each other is carefully managed as well. What I would say is if this becomes an issue within your workforce, that you take advice on it. Because it's protected under the Equality Act, you could be looking at big compensation payouts under injury to feelings, and you don't want to be on the front of the Daily Mail for this. Nobody does. So like I say, treat it carefully, take advice. And it's one of those, you don't want a knee-jerk reaction. Things need to be very carefully thought about before taking any action or making any decisions. What we are seeing is companies asking for policies around this sort of stuff. What I would say, it's becoming a very fluid subject. It's changing all the time. So again, if you are going to have a policy around this, it might be something that you'll need to review regularly. And perhaps even consult with your staff on it and involve people in those decisions so that you've got buy-in. So moving on to the case law update. So Hutchinson versus Asda. So this is one that, again, that we were talking with the BBC about. This related to an employee, so Mrs. Hutchinson, who was 73 years old and had dementia. She worked in Asda. I think it was in the George section, so she was involved in putting stock out and being on the floor. It became very obvious to her colleagues that she was struggling with dementia. And what we saw in this was some very well-meaning behaviour from her colleagues that ultimately landed Asda in a tribunal, and they lost. So Mrs. Hutchinson won on unfair dismissal and disability discrimination and age discrimination. Now, the key behaviours here were that Mrs. Hutchinson was asked by a line manager twice whether she wanted to retire, and a colleague rummaged in her bag to help her find her keys. So in terms of the retirement question, you may well think, well, she was unwell, she was what would probably be classed as elderly. Was that not a reasonable question to ask her? And what the tribunal did accept was this wasn't asked in an aggressive way, it was asked in a way that was well-meaning. However, the point here being that if you had a 23-year-old with a health issue, you probably wouldn't ask them if they wanted to retire. So that question was entirely centred around the fact that she was 73 years old. So it was found to be age discrimination. And what Asda had done here was they picked the wrong process. Rather than focusing on her age, a capability process here to look at whether, because of her health, Mrs. Hutchinson was able to do her job anymore, that would have been a more appropriate process. And what the tribunal actually found was, had they gone through a capability process, the likelihood was she would have been dismissed anyway 2 or 3 months later. So that was the age discrimination and disability discrimination part. Now, in terms of the rummaging through her bag to find her keys, again, this was found to be very well-meaning. The judge accepted that at work she'd become confused. She couldn't find her keys or her bus pass, and that a colleague had taken her bag and gone through it to help her find her stuff. Now, again, this centered around consent. And what the judge found was that the colleague simply took the bag and went through, well-meaning, trying to help her, rather than asking, how can I help you? Would you like me to check through your bag? Or perhaps calling a family member to say, look, we think a bit of additional help is needed at work. And that presumption of taking the bag and going through it, that was disability discrimination. So even on a case where the judge accepted that there was nothing sinister around anything that had happened, it was all very well-meaning, Asda still went down on it. Now, the reality is, for the size of Asda, they should have known better. However, for a smaller employer, this would have been something that could easily have tripped somebody up. So just be mindful of that. If you have got a staff member who's got difficulties, or there's something where you think, actually, this is a bit of a sensitive subject, I think it needs to be approached in the right way, do make sure that you're taking advice from it. Perhaps if you're in a position of HR, talk to some other peers. If you've got in-house legal, have a chat with them, or take some external advice as well. So the learning points from that case were, choose the right process, and that even the best intentions can have negative consequences and financial consequences to businesses. So moving on to now, I'm going to have a really good go at this name. I said it on the BBC, and I'm pretty sure I got it wrong, even though I Googled how to pronounce it. So I think it's Anua and Croydon Health Service. So this is the Crofts decision. This centered around a nurse who, she was actually a theatre nurse, so she worked in surgery, and she would display a small golden cross on her neck, and she was a devout Christian. She did not see this cross as a piece of jewellery. It was her displaying her religion. Now, she was repeatedly asked by her line manager to remove the cross. And there seems to be a lot of focus of attention on this individual. And ultimately, she was removed from her duties in theatre, and she was placed on the equivalent of a reception desk because she refused to comply. Now, what the health service said was that the cross was an infection risk, and if she leant over a patient, that it could fall in a wound, or someone could grab hold of it, and it would be a risk for her health and safety. Which, on the face of it, that all sounds very reasonable. Now, the individual in this case actually did her own audit of staff within the health service. So the health service had a policy that says no jewellery beyond a wedding band and studs in the ears. And when she did her audit, she found that there was an anaesthetist who had dangling earrings, that there were staff who were wearing religious bangles, headdresses, dangling jewellery from necklaces, nose rings. The policy was clearly not being consistently enforced, and this lady was being singled out. Now, she also sought expert opinion around the risk of infection with this cross, and essentially it came down on her side to say, well, the reality is that it's minimal. It will be no more than a wedding band. She wore the cross quite tightly up to her throat, so it didn't dangle down over any patients. And she had a quick release clasp, so if someone had grabbed it from around her throat, it would break off. The tribunal ultimately found in her favour. They found that she'd been singled out. They found that the process and the policy hadn't been consistently applied across the workforce, and that it was discrimination. So she was successful on unfair dismissal, and she was also successful on religious discrimination as well. So the learning points from that are, be consistent in how policies are applied, but not only that, ensure that if you have a policy, so the health board had a policy that she was technically in breach of, but make sure that the policies are justified and are reasonable as well. So if you've got a policy that actually falls on the side of being totally unreasonable, that you might need to review that and have a think about how that policy is applied as well.